Hello, this is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. This is a special episode today. I'm joined by Trace and Andrew Stratelates. This is partly the result of a Twitter exchange that was going on a couple weeks ago between Trace and Dave over this new current situation that we have, which is the end of the liberals rules-based order, and the idea of the rise of identity politics. So basically, let's just pick the 80s as an example. Both Democrats and Republicans, conservatives and liberals, more or less accepted the system worked. And they would take turns, in the electoral system. Sometimes you get a Democrat president, sometimes you get a Republican president. But everybody was still basically an American, and everybody was still basically believing in the system. 40 years out, that's totally gone now. Many people don't believe in the system anymore. They believe some Democrats believe that the Republicans rigged the system in their favor, and some Republicans believe the Democrats rigged the system in their favor. And so the idea that the system can be relied upon as this neutral arbitrator is falling apart. Now, also, as corresponding to that, we have the rise of identities that are not the U.S. They're not the U.S. government. They're not the U.S. as a nation, but they're more insular and particularist identities. Sometimes those identities are sex. Sometimes those identities are race. Sometimes those identities are religion. But all of these other identities that are rising are in part arising as a result of the failure of this order. And I think that's where this conversation is going to really try to dig into what is feeding into this. What does this portend for the future? So new to the channel here is Trace. So I'll let you introduce yourself, Trace.
Yeah, it's great to be here. I am an online writer and currently in law school. I used to work for a podcast called Blocked and Reported, which touches on a lot of niche culture war stories, deep dives into online controversies, and specific, examples of culture falling apart in one small way or another. More broadly, in my history, I grew up in Utah as a devout Mormon. I served a Mormon mission in Sydney, Australia, and I was at the same time pretty online from a pretty early age, which led me to have sort of this tension between what is more or less one of the most traditionalist, large, still stable sub-societies in the United States, and looking at everything in the online world and, seeing all the disputes and all the flare-ups that were going on with there. I got older, and the older I got, the more tension I saw, and the more I just realized I fundamentally could not accept the truth claims of Mormonism. No matter how much I dug trying to find the answers, all the answers were just pointing towards, look, it fundamentally is not accurate, which led me shortly after my mission, a couple of years later, to step away and make a clean break from the Mormon Church, at which point I started realizing, I might want to marry a man. Wound up meeting, dating, and then marrying my husband, and we've been together about 6 years now. And from there, really being deeply concerned with trying to find some stability, some order, some sense in a world that feels like it has gone mad around me and maybe started out mad. And in particular, trying to find basically the way through where I can live in peace alongside my Mormon family, as, a gay married man, is kind of at the core of what I want to do in politics and what I want to do in culture.
Okay, Andrew.
Hey everyone, I have collaborated with Todd in the past, and I know Trace is sort of adjacent to me in the Twitter sphere. We're sort of both teapot and technology adjacent, as well as politics. I'm a traditional Anglican, and my latest project working on American Tory, which is sort of an alternative conservative or right-wing political philosophy consistent with sort of American culture that is neither sort of the libertarian style right-wing nor the sort of classical liberalism and leftism. I have a background in technology. I grew up in a relatively conservative part of the country, and I am here to be just sort of the right-wing weirdo. So,
all right, I'll just briefly. I could go into a lot, but most people who watch this channel know what I stand for and advocate for. But I'll just say briefly, in regards to this political discussion, in the 60s, before the early 60s, before the culture war got really big and created a country with a series of subcultures, there was this inflection point where the anti-war movement and the labor movement were really getting head of steam, right? So they were reacting to the Vietnam War. They were challenging the power of the bourgeoisie. I'm trying to pick up where they left off because one of the things that's important is the singer-songwriter Phil Oakes, who sadly committed suicide in '76, said that a lot of this was CIA funded and he didn't use the term deep state, but deep state funded, because if you're going to have a pushback against the war machine, against the bourgeoisie, you don't want to have a country that's fragmented along all of these cultural lines. You want a agreed upon cultural consensus. And he's like, yeah, well, it's over now. That's partly what fed into his suicide, is he saw that there was no way to rebuild those pieces. So I think actually the first thing to ask is what leads to the rise of these identities, right? Now, I'm going to make a case that I want to hear both of your opinion on. In the 50s, the United States, if you look at a Democrat or a Republican, they were broadly the same, right? There was on most cultural issues. Now, of course, they had political differences, economic policy, foreign policy, so on and so on. But broadly speaking, the idea of being an American, right? So if we want to go to like Walter Lippmann and Managed Democracy and the Mass Man, they all agree that, okay, we're Americans. Now, this is also the heyday of the New Deal era, which has strong labor regulations against corporations. Now, part of the problem is, from the point of view of corporations, you don't want this level of solidarity amongst your workers and support within the government, within both conservative Republicans. So, for example, La Follette was a Republican from out west in the 20s. And also you had Democrats. So it was a bipartisan support for this pro-labor position. You want to break all this up. And we can see this with like the Verge's heat map on Whole Foods, where they have a diversity index that measures the likelihood of a unionization in a workforce. And the higher that diversity index correlated to unionization is lower. So almost all of these identity politics that we see now are, I argue, downstream effects of the culture war, which I argue was intentionally stimulated by elements within the security state, using what I call, as a catch-all phrase to describe this, counter gangs led by engaging in a frozen conflict. So a geopolitically frozen conflict would be North-South Korea. There's no active military conflict going on, though it could flare up at any time, and the war isn't over. There's just an armistice. So that's the frozen conflict part. The counter gang part is where you have people being led by elites that are not a part of them, that don't represent their interests, but some other ulterior motive. The term itself was invented by Frank Kitson in the 50s when he disrupted the Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya by funding other, quote, nationalist movements to fight back, so that all that energy was diffused. So my position is that most of these cultural identities that are now becoming reified and entrenched are the result of this. So I guess the first thing I want to say is, what are your thoughts on that, Trace, as an explanation for the rise of these identity movements?
I see where you're coming from, but I disagree almost entirely. I disagree deeply and fundamentally with that description of things. I think your identity comes to the forefront. One aspect of your identity comes to the forefront in the political sphere as soon as you feel that aspect being attacked in a way that feels deep and fundamental, that you can't control or can't address without, leaning on that identity aspect. And I think that it has been part of American politics from the very beginning. As much as I disliked the 1619 Project in details, I think it is very accurate to say that identity politics has been part of American history since 1619. That is, as soon as people decided to bring slaves into America, people brought fundamentally identity politics into all of it, and it has not changed since then. just between race relations. You can go through the history. You can look at the Civil War. You can look at after that Reconstruction, after that the Jim Crow era, the Civil Rights Movement, all of that. In this heyday that you're pointing to, New Deal, 50s, all of that, a lot of people were still focused a lot on some really intense identity questions. There were race riots. There was a lot going on at that time. Even aside from race things, look, I come from a state that exists because my people were driven from place to place to place until they went far the heck away from everyone else into the desert to settle where they could build their own place. I come from a state where the people that I'm from, it was technically legal to kill Mormons in the state of Missouri until the 1970s. That is the history that I come from. And people were always deeply aware of these identitarian elements in all of it. And just because it didn't always enter into politics, the only reason it didn't enter in is when it's not under threat. As long as people feel secure, as long as they feel respected, as long as they feel like they have a place, they have a position, they don't need to defend their identity. That's when the identity stuff starts fading. And the people who don't really feel like they need to defend it, they're pretty relaxed. But whenever something fundamental to someone comes under threat, you are going to see politics like that arise, and they will get vicious.
Okay, Andrew.
Yeah, I guess my perspective is that identity politics typically in the modern era is a example of the same type of thing that the founders called faction. And that a major issue in this is that since we have so many centralized powers in our society and civilization, be it the Supreme Court or the White House or Congress or the mainstream media or academia, that the issues, right, are grounded in material conditions, as Trace said, of security and the needs of daily life, end up becoming much higher stakes because everything's renormalized into these centralized things. And the other issue that I think occurs, right, and I think Trace's example of the Mormons is a great illustration of this, is that procedural liberalism works when it's functionally the same as tolerance, right? When you had the original colonies, and it was basically Puritans and maybe Roman Catholics, everyone kind of agreed on enough that fundamental things didn't get discussed. And when that is the case, and you have an appropriate federal system, things tend not to blow over into large cultural tensions or civil war, either politically or literally. And so I think those are the two major factors, right? Is that the United States is a lot less homogenous now in the teleology that people affirm. And we have centralized institution. And so a lot more combative things will just occur because of those two factors.
Right. So now, with regards to, because I want to argue these two are related, both the collapse of the liberal order and the rise of these identity groups. So the reason why I hedged it or described it the way I did is, since the liberal order itself is falling apart and the sort of external pressure downward on groups is being removed because of its falling apart, that means it's not the explanation for the rise of these identities, because it itself is now falling apart. So it can't exert the force that one might posit it would. So I would argue now these things sort of have a life of their own, but also too, as a complex system collapses and people have to then figure out, well, who do I trust? Who do I rely on? How do I get my life going? They then think in more local terms out of necessity. We could look at the Roman Empire in the 5th century. When the central political system fell in the West, people started thinking about terms more locally. Rather than being a Roman citizen, a part of the Roman Empire, you're now, a Briton living in, Saxon Britain, or, an Ostrogoth living in Italy. So I would want to argue here that as Okay, let me use this analogy. You have an old growth forest where the trees are destroyed in a fire, the older ones. That would be the collapse of the liberal order. That means the smaller trees that have been growing up under the shade underneath some aspect or shadow of that order are now growing. So in one sense, they have to be a product of that order because they're growing up inside of it. But as that order collapses, they now are struggling to define themselves. What are your thoughts on that? Go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, so just one point I make is that there are two of identity politics that people use for that label, right? One is like your identity as a Utah Mormon, right? Where there's a identity marker, but there's also these thick bonds of community and even hierarchy, right? And then there are other identities that are less about what culture or society you're in, and more about like what markers you have and how other people might perceive you superficially, right? And one of the tension I'm into is that like these thick identities that are actually based on your role in the community are like legitimately powerful, right? And are in some sense isomorphic just to politics. But the issue is like intersectionality, for example, seems primarily a almost like marketing scheme to get people to act as in solidarity in a democracy, right? And so that's part of those have different aspects in your tree analogy, right? Because like you are in the culture thing that grows up under liberalism, but your exact intersection of how you should vote doesn't seem to be like naturally growing in that forest, metaphorically.
Okay, Trace.
Yeah, so there are a lot of threads I could lean in to here, and it'll be tricky to like find the tidiest way through. But in terms of looking at the collapse of the liberal order as a whole, the major thing that I think needs to be considered is that every era seems to have new religions rise up. And I'm using religion broadly here to mean something even beyond just like belief in God, but more of a unifying moral force behind people's actions. And every era seems to have new religions rise up to meet the needs of that era, even as the old ones stay, and often they wrestle together and figure out what to do. So you can go all the way back to the Peace of Westphalia to see what I would say was the start of the liberal order in many ways. And what the start of that order was looking around and one extremely powerful, extremely rooted hierarchical institution saying, fine, we don't have control anymore. We are ceding some of the political territory. Instead of being this one unifying institution that looks and says, we will define politics, we will define science, we will define culture, we will define all of these things, it said, fine, we're retreating from some of these areas. And then the scientific revolution, similar thing, they say with things like evolution and everything, reluctantly dragging their feet, grudgingly over time, they're like, okay, fine, we're retreating from these areas a little bit, we're retreating from these institutions a little bit. And meanwhile, in each new era, new things will rise up. So Mormonism is a good example here, and many other religions during the Great Revival period in the 1800s, where you had all of these people frustrated, needing something, wanting some outlet, and building new identities and new groups that were responsive to that time, and then building more within that. More recently, you're seeing a decline of many of these traditional faiths, a substantial decline of many of these traditional faiths, where you go into a lot of church buildings and it's just really old people there and slowly dwindling congregations without a lot of fresh blood coming in. And what's happening with that is the current liberal frame in the United States in very many ways was centered around the idea of these institutions as being a really large part of it, implicitly just because that's the way they were functioning for people. But as it's been losing its sway, it's been dwindling as a uniting force, new religions have been coming in. And new religions, whereas now most of us, I would say most Christians today are what I'd call tame Christians. They have accepted the liberal order as the way things are. They have accepted that Christianity does not define all of politics. They have accepted that Christianity does not define all of science. They have accepted fundamentally that there are other large sweeping forces that they need to reckon with and that they cannot fully assert power over, even as they would want to. But that's not the natural state of a religion. The natural state of a religion is a certain all-consuming vitality, a certain we know the right way, we will pull others towards this right way, and we will shape all of society in our image. And I think as you've been seeing the rise of social justice progressivism, it has really resembled one of these vital traditional religions, and it's been many people's first experience with one of these vital traditional religions. And yeah, you have things like intersectionality pulling it together, and I would say that is an example of a really non-functional or a destructive doctrine. And the reason it's destructive is that you have so many complex elements of someone's identity. You have good and bad from each part of one person's identity. And intersectionality frames itself as, oh, we are unifying all these disparate identities into one whole. But really it's saying, we are creating a matrix of oppression with these identities, and your experiences as a minority group are going to be legitimized in this frame only to the extent you can portray yourself as oppressed, and your experiences in a majority will be legitimized only to the extent people can portray you as an oppressor, whereas the reality is a lot more complex than that. Even saying all of that, though, as people rise up and as people build these new identities, whatever, something like me, for example, I don't love words like gay, and I don't love like the way it's turned into like this broad sweeping identity thing. But no matter how I think of it, and no matter how I act, and no matter whether I want to be like this quiet, monogamous, anything like that, it is very clear to me, and it was very clear, as soon as I started dating a man, a lot of people are reacting to me very, very differently based on this. And a lot of people based on this are suddenly treating me as a fundamentally different person, and are suddenly threatening my interests in different ways, and are suddenly attacking me in different ways. And suddenly, whether I like it or not, I have to carve out space and make it clear that, no, this is who I want to be and how I want to be. And in as much as there are threats to that, I will respond. And I think a lot of that stuff plays in with all the tensions there. So yeah, to wrap it all together, you have the decline of Christianity, the rise of a new unifying religious movement, and in and around all of that, you have people looking for answers to the needs of a current day. And if a dysfunctional system is the thing that is most compellingly responding to those needs, then that's the thing, even if its answers are bad, that's the thing people gravitate towards.
Another way to describe this push-pull mechanic of the collapse of both the liberal order and the rise of identity politics is this. So at the beginning of the bourgeois revolution in the late 17th, early 18th century, we have, well, I guess this would be more like the middle 18th century, actually. Voltaire talks about how the rise of the merchant class in England and then later on in France was an improvement over the wars of religion, because he says, as long as you pay in green, nobody cares what your religion is, because that was the conflict in France between the Protestants and the Catholics. And so in a sense, I think liberalism at one point was that vital religion you're talking about, Trace. It was the idea that you could have, in a lot of ways, it was kind of a mutated Puritanism, because for the Puritans, they wanted, lex rex, the law is king, but the law they wanted was biblical law, whereas liberalism wanted the law of an abstract financial property rights system. And that system worked as long as people had a chance of getting involved in it. But as wealth accumulates and more people get left behind, millennials, Zoomers, Gen A, they're going to all have lives much, much inferior to boomers and Xers. So now you have a large body of discontented people that no longer buy into the system. That's one driving factor. But now, as we become increasingly divided, even the older generations that at one point happy with the system because it quote unquote worked for them doesn't even work for them anymore. And so now, because in a sense the bottom had fallen out and there was a large body of people without property, good example of how this can lead to political violence is the late Roman Republic. You have all these soldiers coming back home from the war against Carthage, and their properties got sold off because their wives and children couldn't operate the entire estate while they were away for 20 years fighting. And so now in Rome, that led to political upheaval with Marius, Sulla, and Caesar. But I think without necessarily having gone to war, but just the accumulation of wealth in the hands of a few, this is also a driving factor. What are your thoughts on that, Trace?
Yeah, so I think that you're absolutely correct to point to liberalism as a sort of broader uniting thing. And this was always the promise of liberalism. And this is, in fact, why I am an ardent defender of liberalism now. Not just liberalism. You can't just have liberalism. You can't have this like liberalism all consuming down to the individual, no broader groups, anything like that. But you need it as a peace treaty between groups. And the reason you need it as a peace treaty between groups is that we've seen what happens when you lack that peace treaty. And it is much worse for, I would argue, much worse for all of us, even the groups that think they will come out on top with it. It's a threat of a retreat to a war of all against all in many ways. And in terms of, is it failing, is it not? I think that there are a lot of serious institutional issues. People overstate it at times. Broadly speaking, the economy still works. Broadly speaking, most people, even in this day and age, are better off economically than they have been in the past. And if you look at like the financial state of Zoomers relative to previous generations, they're not actually doing worse than previous generations, even as their expectations have risen. But they are lacking something. They are missing something, and there is clearly something destabilizing. You can point to a lot of institutional failures and a lot of areas of institutional capture and a lot of areas of cultural drift that I find compelling with this. I'm not wildly compelled by the pure economic explanations, in large part because economic difficulty has always existed and economic struggle has always existed. And even during some really highly functional times, or times people would treat as highly functional, economics as a whole for most people were much worse than they are now. You know, it's not like it's not like the average person in the 1930s was better off than the average person in the 2010s. It's not like the average person in the 1950s even is better off than the average person in the 2010s. But there is a collapsing cultural sense and a way in which institutional trust is decaying that I think is really relevant, even as I'm less convinced by those economic explanations.
So what I'm hearing is you think that economics might be a aggravating factor or something like that, but there's something else going on that is more psychological or cultural. Is that a good way to summarize what you said?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, I want to clarify something here because I think, Trace, you misunderstand where I was going with economics here. If you read the writings of the early 20th century advocates of the 20th century liberal project, such as, for example, Walter Lippmann, and even the early Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire, the idea was that if you could change people's primary loyalty from religion to economic activity in a market, you could produce a situation of peace because they operating on a materialist paradigm that struggle arises from the conflict over scarce resources. That's not what I'm saying. That's what they said about their project. And I'm saying because those are the assumptions of their project, we're beginning to see it fail. That's where I was going. Not I don't know if you caught that.
Okay, yeah, so I see what you mean with that. And I would say, yeah, you know, I'm still broadly sympathetic to those assumptions. Not fully sympathetic. I think it's not a perfect picture of the world, but I do think broadly that a lot of conflicts are over material resources. And as, you know, in the better times are, the less fundamental the conflicts need to be, certainly. But I don't think you can remove or even should remove these other sources of meaning, these other centers, these other like unifying moral orders. And I think a liberalism that attempts to dissolve all of them is misunderstanding the value of liberalism as a peace treaty or trying to pursue, an end, a different end.
Yeah, so I'd like to investigate this liberalism as peace treaty a little bit. So one of the issues, at least in Europe, is during the early modern period where the quote-unquote wars of religion happened, basically all the state's solutions to things were just executing people, right? And so the solution for a heretic or for someone who was not in communion with the Pope or what have you was to execute them, right? Rather than socially censure them or fine them or even imprison them. And there are lots of factors here, right? But at least initially, liberalism was this liberality with people that had close to the same ideology and philosophy, right? And to me, it seems that that is functionally the equivalent of just tolerance, right? And so, like, what's the major difference between being in, say, liberal France, so to speak, compared to a tolerant France where they're like, well, you don't get state funding for being an Anglican, but we won't, so we won't like help you, but we're not going to significantly, we're not going to execute you, right? And part of the issue with liberalism is that if you're in a position of being subordinated due to whatever factor, right? Let's use Anglicans in Utah, right? In some sense, liberalism says, no, actually, you should be fully equal, even though since you're not part of this culture, you will have demeritus things, right? Just because you're not part of it, or I'm not aligned with the values that they hold, or the theology, or what have you, right? And so my concern is liberalism does work as a peace treaty, at least initially, compared to executing everyone. But it also has this like inherent contradiction of equality when it's at this sort of unified individual level that we have, right? And it could work. Liberalism does work in like a federal society, right, where it's sort of synthetically abstracted away from day-to-day life, right, where there's a liberal federal government and each state can have their own communities and values, and that the federal government just basically provides security and a few other things. But what are your thoughts on this, Trace, of whether liberalism does too much compared to its sort of raison d'etre of providing a peace treaty between people of different religions?
Yeah, I mean, I think modern liberalism has in many ways become too disintegrating, too like all-consuming. I think people are not wrong about that. So in terms of, do I necessarily think that a minarchist state with many different states having their own policies is the way things should be? Not exactly. I think that it is, I'm pretty Hobbesian in my attitude towards the state. I think it's useful to have a strong authority at the top that keeps the peace for everyone. And I think you do need a degree of seriousness about central governance for that. But I do think the main role of this sort of central governance, if you look at something like Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, for example, what he saw his role as in a lot of ways was you build something of a sense of a common identity that people can unite around. And then you are aware of and you respect the different groups that people are in without trying to like tip the balance towards one, or without trying to like favor one over the other in this way or another, with like seriously working with groups and taking them seriously without pitting them against each other, without figuring out ways to like fight them against each other or whatever, but like being conscious of the populace you have and the groups that are in it, and letting them be groups, letting them do their things with that. And, I don't think we're exactly at that point in the United States. I think we're a rather more individualistic than that, but I think it would be a positive direction to shift to.
Yeah, the one critique I'll offer there is it seems to work for Singapore, but one of the things with like having a multi-ethnic state is each ethnicity, even if they have slightly different priorities or slightly different tensions because they have a thicker local identity than the sort of global national one, their values and goals can be aligned, right? So you can see the same thing that happened in like Catholic Europe before the Reformation, right, where you had multiple nations, and there were some conflicts, right, but there was some amount of unity, and up until at least like the 9th century, the Pope was able to actually smooth things over across these multiple ethnicities. And the issue we run into in America and in the modern world is you don't just have different ethnicities, right, that have different desires and values that can readily be negotiated. You have issues of like basically dealing with like libertarians and Marxists, right? And one of the issues with liberalism is if you don't have that cultural power unified to properly be intolerant to those interests, they end up unraveling things even if they don't succeed, right? Just because of the misalignment of values.
So one thing I want to add here, because we want to get to the point of we've been discussing provisionally how we all think we got here, but the real meat of this discussion is going to be, well, what do we do if people? Okay, maybe Trace wants to preserve elements of the liberal order. Maybe other people want to preserve elements of the liberal order. That's one thing. But the problem is that there's this massive push, and that's what you feel stuck in the middle here, Trace, from the right and the left, rejecting that. And then the question becomes, well, what's the way forward? Now, we could have one model of interpretation whereby because this order is perceived to be or actually collapsing, people believe it to be so. And the fact that they believe it to be so is actually more important than whether it is or isn't, because that's what they're going to act on. So then the question is, how could a modus vivendi between these groups be provided if liberalism isn't used? I think that's really what people are interested in. So what would you say to that, Trace? What would you say would be another way to do this if liberalism isn't agreed upon anymore?
I mean, look, I am a liberal and I will continue to be a liberal. I think that we need liberalism with teeth. I think that liberalism faces threats from the left and it faces threats from the right. I think it faces increasing threats from people who who sense weakness and who want to say, all right, this order has failed. We're moving to a different one. Everyone step aside. We're going to have, our based dissident right order, or we're going to have a full cultural revolution. We're going to have our socialist order, anything like that. I think that people who value liberalism and people who value the peace treaty need to look around and say, no, absolutely not. There is a reason we have this treaty, and there is a reason we have fought so hard to preserve it, and we will keep preserving it. That people are not going to come in and sweep it away and build some new system on top of it and say, oh, this will be so much better, because I think that will lead many disastrous places. But obviously that is not the only answer. And for me, the most urgent thing to look at is, as someone who came from a pretty unified, pretty serious deliberate community within liberalism, I think a lot of people lack that sort of unified, serious, deliberate community. And for me, the most urgent need for people who feel that, and for people who are looking to what do we build, what do we do with all of that, is to look for and look, for me, it's complicated because I do take my impression of truth seriously, and I don't accept the truth claims of Christianity, so I don't accept just like return to Christianity. But I think basically the challenge facing someone like me, this post-Christian liberal in this order that we find ourselves in, is say, what is something stable that I can build? What is a useful institution that fills in the gaps that liberalism doesn't necessarily fill, built on top of liberalism, compatible with liberalism, but firm within that? And then how can we, attract that while at the same time addressing broader institutional problems?
So something you said earlier, right, that if you are in an identity group that feels like it is being its interests are not being met by the current order, just right at both the negative level, right, you don't feel secure, and two, you don't feel you're getting what you need to thrive or pursue your interests. Let's say you said that it's very clear that having solidarity and attempting to change the deal is rational. So how does that square with the what you said, that we need to keep liberalism, right, Because what you're going to end up with is conflict between people that feel that they're being mistreated by the current order and anyone who wants to maintain this current order.
I mean, look, politics is conflict. Politics has always been conflict by another name. And so what do you do with it? You hear people's concerns, you listen to them, you listen carefully, and you try to figure out like what is a balance, a pragmatic, stable balance that will satisfy as many people's concerns as realistically possible as much as the time. It's a process of trying to figure out a stable resting point between these things, while saying, yeah, we understand that there are a lot of groups that are going to try to dominate, and if they try too hard to get too much of their way and to bring everyone else too much to heel, we will rely on pulling a lot of others together and stomping that, telling them to knock it off, and
So why should we even have a nation then? I mean, at that point, why don't we just divide up into separate nations that all pursue the community interest directly and negotiate this internationally?
Because people don't want that. I mean, you want that, perhaps, but most people don't, because most people are, one of their deep fundamental identities is American. And one of the things that a lot of people genuinely value is this sense of Americanness and the sense of working together in this broad culture.
But you've said that isn't sufficient ground for political stability, because if you're a minority, right, that isn't being well served by the broad American identity, you have to pursue other politics.
I mean, I think everyone, this is the whole, so you're saying this as if it's something new. This is the whole history of American politics, and this is the broader history of democratic politics. Like, right, this sort of conflict is not fundamentally new. It's never fundamentally deeply resolved. There's always a bit of tension, but you build within the tension and you productively iterate within all of that.
Yeah. And
hold on, Andrew. Let me interject here real quick. Sure. So I think what we're really touching on here, and I think this would help clarify the discussion for everybody here. Trace, we're touching on the paradox of tolerance with Karl Popper. In an open society, we're supposed to tolerate people. But then the problem is, for example, in the Cold War, if you tolerated the Communist Party, they might try to overthrow your government. And so you can't really tolerate them. And in the 30s, for example, if the liberal movement tolerated the Nazi Party in some Western European country, that could be seen as a fifth column. So there's going to be some groups that are just not going to be allowed a seat at the table because of the paradox of tolerance. Now, I think where many on the right are afraid is that we know the labels that are going to be used to say this is a not tolerated right-wing position. And then the problem is, well, how plastic is this definition? Because, we've seen with the more extreme elements of the Democratic Party that you've even commented on being put away, using terms like Nazi, racist, and white supremacist in a way that is not calculated to reduce the temperature in the political room. And they're concerned that, well, hold on, are we just all going to be lumped into this category and then just not be allowed a seat at the table? I think that's where a lot of people on the right are afraid. And I think that's where, in some of the instances where you're engaging with people on Twitter and maybe they don't respond in the way that you would hope with the intentions that you put in, that might be part of it.
Yeah, and basically what I'm pointing out, or trying to point out, right, and sorry if I'm getting a little tense, is that the things that you dislike, right, including the rhetoric on Twitter, right, and sort of the knives out politics, is going to be a necessary condition to liberal democracy, right, because of this inherent contradiction between, well, our loyalty is all to America and liberal principles, but also we necessarily have to preserve our own interests, possibly at the expense of others, because no one else will, right? And that tension is one of the reasons why we have such a belligerent system. And the question I have is why you don't seem willing to accept that cost for liberalism. Or maybe I'm misinterpreting your position here, right? I easily could be wrong on this.
So, to clarify, what specific cost do you feel like I'm not willing to accept or not willing to face head on. I understood the broad sense of what you're saying, but I'm still not clear on the specific cost you feel like I'm not willing to accept.
Yeah, it feels like you want and I'm sympathetic, right? I'm not a belligerent person by temperament. It sounds like you want a political process where the emphasis is on good governance and win-win negotiation rather than like win-lose rhetoric, right? And I don't think that liberalism actually fosters that.
So I don't think recent U.S. liberalism has precisely fostered that, and that's one reason why I'm so critical of it. A big reason I'm so critical of it. I think that it has ceded far too much ground very regularly and over a long period of time to illiberal forces from the left, and has treated them as sort of like fundamentally aligned and fundamentally friendly to it in ways that have been really destructive. I think you can go back to FDR and look at this. His incredibly risky and long-term devastating sympathies to Stalin. You can trace like all of these things that conservatives trace between then and now. That stuff's not made up. That stuff's real, and American liberalism hasn't really grappled with it. American liberalism hasn't really addressed it. And I think people are correct to say, well, yeah, there are a lot of illiberal forces creeping into this, and there are a lot of ways that people are trying to alter or break the deal. That's real. What's also real is that a lot of the liberal criticisms of conservatives are accurate. You know, it was actually a major struggle to overcome segregation by law. And I think it was absolutely correct to overcome segregation by law. It was a major legal struggle to get to the point where someone like me can get married and have kids. And I absolutely deeply value the potential to get married and have kids. And anyone who wants to take that away from me, you know, that is one of those fundamental things that I will defend and I will work for. So in terms of like getting frustrated with belligerence and getting frustrated with things like that, there are parts of it. You know, on the one hand, I understand meta-level reasons why people from left and people from right get belligerent and get frustrated because parts of their values are under threat. And at the same time, I see them doing things and saying things that create fundamental enmity and that stir deep enmity, doing things that look explicitly to trample on others, to disrespect others, to tear apart others, to do things that destabilize and attack others for the benefit of themselves. And I think that they are defecting in real and important ways that will lead to further tension and further destruction unless some people come in and balance things and keep a handle on things and diffuse those tensions. So yeah, I think a lot of those people like that, you know, obviously they're part of the process, they need to be responded to, but the specific roles they play are destructive and damaging roles for the most part.
So let me, because I think you're near this line here, Andrew, right? The question we're running up against here is the paradox of tolerance, called out by Karl Popper. So here's the problem for many on the right. So after the World War II consensus, right, the element of the right that wasn't allowed to sit at the table was National Socialism, and on the left it was Stalinist communism. That was the Cold War consensus. Now, many on the right believe that term Nazi has been expanded and used to describe people that don't actually believe that, to then remove their seat at the table. So they thought they had a seat at the table. They were playing that paradox of tolerance game, and then they feel like they're being kicked out. And then I suppose people on the left probably think that too. That would be the more extreme elements on the left you've talked about. So the question is, where do we draw the lines for defining who doesn't participate in this process, sans the paradox of tolerance?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think people are, first off, I think some people are right to perceive that they were unreasonably kicked out and that the definition of Nazi and so forth was unreasonably expanded, and people are getting too aggressive with that. At the same time, I think that there are people, an increasing amount of people, who, no matter what era of US history you go back to, if you go back to the 20s, 30s, whatever, and you say a lot of the projects that these people have and a lot of the things that the goals that these people have, immediately, like someone like Herbert Hoover from back in the day would look at them and say, oh, you're the enemy. Oh, you're trying to crush this good thing we have going. Oh, you're trying to destroy the peace and you're trying to oppress others, whatever. Like there was a broad American, not ever a universal consensus, but there are people who are very actively working to destroy that. I would say, so what are the principles that I would look to. Look, if someone respects exit rights, that is, a group says, here are our standards. We expect people by our group to live by these standards. If you're not in our group, that's fine. Do your thing. That's one key thing. Something like, say, I think so. Say the Masterpiece Cake Shop test thing in Colorado. That's a good example of it. I think that it is an overreach and a breach of liberal principles to say, oh, you must bake our cake, and if you don't bake this cake, then we will make your life hell. I think that is absolutely a breach of liberal principles, and that's the sort of thing that needs to be called out, attacked aggressively, and corrected.
So how does this square with you believing that state powered integration is appropriate?
Say more.
So yeah, just to be clear, sort of ironically on the dissident right, I am an integrationist, but it seems like if you're saying that imposing necessary participation in a culture or interactions is forbidden, but then also obligating people to interact with other ethnicities against their will under force of law, these seem to be in tension.
Sure. What I would say in terms of if I'm framing an abstract ideal here is that my abstract ideal is for no force of law banning integration stuff. But no force of law mandating it either. That is,
but that okay. So you're basically taking the same right-wing position of the 1910s, right? Where basically they believed that segregation was against property rights, right? For example, that you should be allowed to freely associate with anyone you want. And okay, but that is different than how desegregation actually worked.
Sure,
right?
It is.
Well, hold on. There's another thing too. I think you're touching on, Andrew, that I think would help if I clarified for Trace, is the arguments made at the time of desegregation were that, well, okay, schools are government property. Anything that's government property, you should be allowed to all taxpayers, regardless of their race. Now, what ended up happening though was at the time they said, well, look, anything private, to what you were saying, Andrew, we're not going to touch that. But they did touch that. They did get to bake the cake or you're going to get blacklisted. And so what people are worried about on the right, and I suppose on the left as well, is what's going to prevent the liberal government from exceeding its mandate again in the same way. It's one thing to say that if you're a taxpayer, regardless of race, you should have access to government services. It's another thing to say, because of that principle, we're going to tell you what to do with your private property.
Yeah, what's going to prevent it? Look, the same thing that's going to prevent things, any bad things throughout history ever, people working to prevent it, and better ideas coming up, older ideas being fought down and pushed against and defeated. Like there is nothing fundamental holding civilization together. There is nothing fundamental holding society together. There is nothing fundamental holding any one specific order together. All you can really do is work to build something good and work to maintain that good thing and work to attract people towards that good thing. So what will prevent it? There will never be anything fundamental to really prevent bad things. You just have to fight for the good things anyway.
Okay, so I just messaged privately. It looks like we've kind of teased out this line of reasoning at the moment, and any further conversation would then lead to another hour. So how about we just put a bookmark in it, and if we feel like there's anything more we need to say, we can have a recap session sometime later. How's that sound?
Sounds good. It's been a pleasure.
All right. Well, I just want to, for the outro, thank you again, Trace, for coming on. Thank you again, Andrew.
My pleasure, and it was a pleasure meeting you on Audio Trace, and may that which grounds your existence do the very best for you.
You as well. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you both. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.